So last week was Palm Sunday, and I mentioned a book from 2004 called The Last Week by John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg. It offers a day-by-day account of the last week that Jesus spent in Jerusalem, taking us from Palm Sunday to Easter Sunday. And you can barely see the subtitle there, but what it says is, what the Gospels really teach about Jesus' final days in Jerusalem. And if you think that the subtitle suggests that the authors disagree with the way that these gospel stories have traditionally been interpreted, you would be correct. Now mind you, Borg and Crossan are not what you would call young starts or amateurs in this field. Marcus Borg was raised Lutheran, later became a part of the Episcopal Church in America, where he held the title of First Canon Theologian. I have no idea what that means, but it sounds impressive. It is something important. I think we have John or Marcus Borg up here. There he is. He says, the Christian life is not about pleasing God, the finger shaker and judge. It is not about believing now or being good now for the sake of heaven later. It is about entering in a relationship in the present that begins to change everything now. Spirituality is about this process, the opening of the heart to the God who is already here. Now on to John Dominic Crossan. He's an Irish-American New Testament scholar. He's a historian of early Christianity, and he's a former Catholic priest. And his quote is this. He says, my point, once again, is not that those ancient people told literal stories and we are now smart enough to take them symbolically, but that they told them symbolically and we are now dumb enough to take them literally. That's that Irish sense of humor coming through there, I think. So in other words, these two have ample experience and ample credentials to write a book like this. And this is the book that gives me the quote that I like to use every year at Easter. It's this one. Believe whatever you want about whether the stories happen this way. Now let's talk about what they mean. If you believe the tomb was empty, fine. Now, what does this story mean? If you believe that Jesus' appearances could have been videotaped, fine. Now, what do those stories mean? And if you're not sure about that, or even if you are quite sure that it didn't happen this way, fine. Now, what do these stories mean? Too often I think people like to get into a big pie fight over what you're supposed to believe, or they get into this long discussion about all of the discrepancies and the contradictions that we can find in the Easter stories in the Bible. And when we do that, we lose sight of the big picture. What message is there for today? What meaning is there in the stories the stories we get from what was basically an Iron Age culture in the Middle East? They're that old. What do those stories mean today? You know, people can argue all they want about what happened. But there's no disputing what happened later, after the original Easter. You know, the Gospels, Paul's letters, Acts of the Apostles, they take us maybe to the year 90. That's it. They don't tell us anything about what happened later, which is the really powerful part of the story. It starts when Jesus goes to Jerusalem and then becomes yet another victim of the ruthless Roman Empire. 300 years later, the religion that was based on the teachings of Jesus has become the official religion of the Roman Empire. All right? So they killed Jesus because they didn't like what he had to say. 300 years later, they take what he had to say and they make it into the official religion of their empire. All right? That's pretty amazing. Now, 160 years after Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire itself started its slow disintegration. Basically disappeared in the form that it was known in Jesus' time. And yet the movement that was started by Jesus kept on going. Nothing supernatural involved in that. Human beings kept the tradition alive because they found something useful, something meaningful, practical, inspiring. Now, that's not to say that there weren't mistakes and atrocities that were committed in the name of that tradition, but the fault was not in the teachings. It was in the followers. Ideas are simply there. We get to choose what we're going to do with them. There were some terrible choices made. Human choices, human errors, error thinking. You know, human beings have this amazing capacity for hypocrisy when it comes to practicing what they claim to preach. The human ego can take anything, and I mean anything, and warp it to serve its own desire for power, wealth, whatever it happens to be. Which is ironic, considering that Jesus demonstrated a way of living that involved giving up the ego, giving up the desire for material gain and worldly power and all that. So I'm thinking that it might be a good idea to keep revisiting these stories as often as it takes, in the hope that one day we might all finally get it. A big part of the story is what happened immediately after the crucifixion. After what we call Good Friday, we know that his followers went into hiding. They were terrified. They were defeated. They were demoralized. A humiliating thing had happened. They didn't know what to make of it. You might say that they went underground for a while, similar to the tomb, right? They were having their own kind of death experience or tomb experience, withdrawing from the world, running from the world. And a couple of things could have happened. They could have disbanded. That could have been the end of the whole thing, decided to forget about it, go back to whatever it was they'd been doing before. Or they could have stayed underground. This whole thing could have turned into some kind of a underground resistance, plotting revenge against Rome. In fact, there was a faction that did that, and we know the result was the disastrous siege at Masada. Those are the kind of things that usually happen when people get backed into a corner. We either run away or lash out. They took the third option. They did something completely different. Within months after the seeming defeat, they had their own, we can call it a resurrection experience. They left the tomb of their own fear and defeat. They left the darkness of the grave, and they walked into the light and the transforming power of courage and compassion. No running away, no lashing out. They were transformed. Something in them had been crucified and then transformed and raised along with Jesus. So in this respect, Easter signifies a major turning point in consciousness. Another favorite author of mine who kind of likes to change things up a little bit is Bishop John Shelby Spong, and he wrote a book called Jesus for the Non-Religious. And this is how he summarizes it. He says, Easter is real. Stirring shifts in consciousness, along with dramatic changes in character, theology, and worship, gripped the followers of Jesus at some point following the crucifixion. These data cannot be dismissed as trivial, for they are in fact quite substantial and quite real. Back to Marcus Borg and John Crossan. These authors tell us that what the disciples experienced through the life and death of Jesus was what it means to be centered in God. There's part of that vision statement that we remind ourselves of each week here, centered in God. This can help us to understand what that vision statement means at a deeper level. Centered in God, we co-create a world that works for all. Being centered in God has nothing to do with a supernatural entity in a far-off place called heaven. We use the word God to describe the very best aspects of humankind. Things like compassion, altruism, spiritual and emotional intelligence, justice, kindness, all of those things. The authors say that this kind of centering produces freedom, compassion, courage. And we have to acknowledge that great things have been done by people who have been centered in these things, centered in the idea of freedom, justice, equality, compassion, and courage. People who in this place of centering overcame the human ego and used Jesus as a role model for that. Dietrich Bonhoeffer comes to mind. He's mentioned by the authors. He found the courage to return to Nazi Germany and lead people in opposition to Hitler. How about Desmond Tutu? Spoke out against apartheid in South Africa with great courage, and then he later became the voice of reason and reconciliation, forgiveness, which helped to keep that country from descending into a bloodbath and violence and revenge when the old regime finally collapsed. And of course, Martin Luther King Jr., who used that same example of centering to keep on in the midst of all of the different threats that he faced: jail, beatings, and ultimately death threats. These are not trivial things, and they're just 3 examples. There are many more, and they all have far-reaching historical significance and resulted in a better world. Real-life examples of how we can do things that we never would have believed possible, including that bit about co-creating a world that works for all. If that ever sounds grandiose or out of reach, remember these examples. Remember what it means to be centered in God, centered in the very best of what we human beings can be. I like to think of Easter as a symbol for that kind of transformed consciousness, that kind of centering. And the Gospels tell stories that human beings interpret as examples of overcoming. Nobody can be like Jesus all the time. And not everyone has to face the same kinds of betrayals and trials and injustice that he did. But the stories invite us to contemplate how things like that are an inevitable part of our shared human experience. And then we have to ask the question, what am I going to make of them? I'm going to close today with some ideas that I found from an organization I just learned of here not too long ago. It's over in the UK. It's called the School of Life. And they published something called the Book of Life. And as far as I can tell, this Book of Life is a book that kind of works like Wikipedia. You know, lots of people contribute to it. There are authors and editors, but they aren't named, which I guess it's like they're trying to set up a no-ego zone, right? An ego-free zone. People contribute to this. The posts and everything, the chapter stories are wonderful, and yet there's nobody there who's getting their ego massaged by writing this stuff. Very interesting. So this particular article that I found, the title of it is called Easter for Atheists. It presents a very convincing argument that all of humankind, including non-Christians and atheists, can find something of great value in the Easter and Easter week narratives. I used to say this about Christmas. I'll say it about Easter now. Easter and Christmas aren't just for Christians anymore. We can discover something universal in all of it. So they start out in this article by asking 2 very important questions. Question number 1, what is the mark of a good life? Question number 2, who should be considered a success? They go on to say that Easter offers a surprising and helpful answer. Success is not about obvious worldly triumph. It's about developing an ability to use one's own suffering as a route to compassion for others. There's a second side to the Easter story. The crucifixion is presented as horrific, but the catastrophe becomes an occasion to promote forgiveness rather than revenge. Among the last words Jesus was meant to have said before he died was the plea, "Forgive them, they don't know what they are doing." Herein lies the fascinating suggestion that cruelty is a symptom of a lack of love and understanding, but it is not the ultimate truth about anyone. A good society understands that we cannot work out how to live unaided. We need role models, guides to show us how we might handle pain and respond to insult and betrayal. And it places figures before us for our consolation and edification. The Christian narrative of Easter is an exemplary educational tale. We perhaps shouldn't worry quite so much whether or not the story is exactly true. What may matter more is whether or not it is helpful. And to that I say, amen, and happy Easter, everyone. See you next week.